The Legend of Dragoon was released in Japan on December 2nd in 1999, and then later in North America on June 11th in the year 2000, and then finally on January 29th in the year 2001 in Europe. It is a timeless adventure that has captivated gamers for years. Dragoon is still well loved as a cult classic. While many can recognize its flaws, they still look back on it fondly as a great game from their more formative years. When people say nostalgia, they're most likely talking about Final Fantasy VII, but secondarily, they very well could be speaking about Legend of Dragoon. Many gamers in their 30s or maybe 40s will have had the opportunity to play Legend of Dragoon, and will likely look back on it fondly as a classic from their younger years. Hi everyone, my name is Casey, and I'm with Critics Compendium, and today we're going to be talking about The Legend of Dragoon. It's a very interesting game, and one that I've always wanted to complete from start to finish, and I have to admit that in my younger years, when I first experienced it, I never even got past about halfway through Disc 2. Legend of Dragoon has 4 discs, by the way, and for a game that was released in the 90s or the early 2000s, that is quite a large game. Now, my wife Jane, who is also a very large part of Critics Compendium, she does lots of stuff behind the scenes to help make this channel flourish and drive it forward. She had never heard of Legend of Dragoon until I brought it up to her. There was even a situation where we tried playing through it once a while back, and the same as what had happened in the past, I made it about halfway through Disc 2, and then some other game captivated us, and we ended up just leaving it to the side. Now, in this game, we're going to be discussing all sorts of different things in regards to Dragoon. We're going to be going over the visual design, the soundtrack, the battle systems, the inventory systems, the general adventuring, as well as the story and the characters. So definitely there will be spoilers in this video, although I'll try to keep the more heavy-handed ones towards the end of the video. Something might slip earlier on as well, so your discretion is advised. The first thing we're going to be talking about is the visual design, which is kind of the first thing you notice when you're looking at a game like this. It looks pretty good for an older game. It stands out pretty well in comparison to other games like Final Fantasy VII, but it tends to fall behind and, not stand up as well if we're looking at something like Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy IX or other games that came out shortly after Dragoon did. As far as a classic game goes, though, the characters look interesting and they have cool designs. The pre-rendered backgrounds are beautiful, and in most locations they have interesting lighting effects and different visual effects to keep things looking flashy and interesting. The enemy designs are wild and wacky, and they don't really make any sense at all, but they're still interesting to discover and look at. As far as the soundtrack goes, it is very unique and mostly enjoyable. I really didn't have much to complain about in regards to pretty much any of the music. I will say that some of it can be a little bit forgettable, but a lot of it is quite memorable and very catchy and doesn't get annoying. In particular, the menu music is something that's going to stick with most players, as they've created a very groovy theme for every time you enter the menu, which is something that you will be doing quite often. The battle music is probably the most important music in a JRPG like this, and they do not falter in this game. The battle music is very catchy, and just like some of the other songs, it never gets annoying. And they do some interesting things where when you're in different parts of the world, you actually get a different variation of the battle music, which also sounds pretty good and is a nice little change up compared to what you're generally used to. Of course, it has some very catchy boss themes as well, which do a good job elevating the intensity of the battle, and it's all very good. One thing that is not so great, though, would be the cutscenes. They definitely do not hold up as well as most of the other game, unfortunately, and especially when they decide to include voice acting. So voice acting in the cutscenes is basically terrible. It's pretty much the only way to really word it. I will say that when you're in the actual battles and your characters are voicing out the names of their attacks and their additions and their magic spells and stuff like that, it comes across as kind of campy, but it's not bad. It fits the style of the battle very well. But when they're trying to be serious and they're doing like actual voice acting in these cutscenes, it really is not very good. And in some cases can borderline ruin the entire scene. There's one particular scene that always comes to mind when I think about this towards the very end of the game, where I was just thinking like, oh man, I wish they just didn't even have voice acting, because you just hear them trying their best, and it just would have been better if it was no voices with just like text on the screen, because it just doesn't sound good. And some people might even say that it kind of ruins the vibe at the end of the game. Back in the day when I first played this game, and I remember my initial thoughts on the cutscenes, I thought they looked pretty cool. There's a couple of the early ones that are really not that bad visually, but now that I'm older and I've played much more and I have much more experience with all sorts of these different games, I really can't say that they hold up very well. So cutscenes are definitely something that is not very good. And while we're on the topic of criticisms here, probably the most important criticism of Legend of Dragoon that I would think is the translation. The translation is really not very good, and also it seems to get worse and worse the further into the game you get. There's even instances where you'll find spelling errors and just like pure grammatical errors, and it's really a shame because the actual plot and the characters in the game are not bad at all. And if you use your own imagination when going through the story and you just kind of apply some generosity to the translation, you can make out what's going on and you can make out the different personalities that the characters have, but you have to put in that kind of effort. And it really is a shame because, you know, a JRPG like this with very interesting characters in general is not helped by the fact that the translation just really kind of sucks. A lot of the characters come across as robotic. They all kind of use the same cadence as they're talking. And there's very rigid like punctuation and a lot of oh my god by all sorts of different characters. And you just wish that they could have done a little bit better in regards to the actual translation. I'm curious about what a Japanese person playing this game in Japanese, or at least somebody who understands Japanese, would feel about playing the original version of the game and whether or not, you know, it came across any better. So that's something to ponder. But as far as the English translations go, definitely something that could have been better for sure, and does hold the game back quite a bit. Next up, we're going to talk about just the general exploration of the game and the different dungeons and villages and towns that you're going to be walking through. As far as the dungeons go, it's pretty basic stuff as far as JRPGs go, especially from this era. You're going to find yourself in different forests, different caves, sometimes some weird mountainous areas, some areas where there's different things going on with gravity or teleporters, alternate dimension type stuff. And then you'll have the basic castle or prison or palace and all these different things that are not too out of this world for a JRPG of this era. And as far as the exploration actually goes, it's reasonably well done for games from this time period. You know, you're going to have these winding roads, and you're going to have forks in a road with branches off, where that's where you're going to find your chests and your different items that are scattered throughout the world. And this is just like how most games from that time will do it. You know, forcing you to take the long path and these big winding trails in order to have you trigger more and more random battles to keep your party leveled up and keep you just getting into fights while you're exploring these different areas. Now, one thing that Dragoon does different than most RPGs is they have this little pointer above your head, which helps you to understand when a fight is going to be coming. And it's such a small little thing, but it's something that I love so much. It just makes you feel so much more confident about when a battle is going to be coming. And I find it just rips away a lot of that frustration that a lot of these, you know, random battle JRPGs have. Like, how many times have you been playing a game like Pokemon or Final Fantasy VI or any of these older games where you enter a location and the encounter rate is just so high and frustrating, and it just feels like every 2 steps you're getting into combat? Well, Legend of Dragoon does have different locations that have higher encounter rate, at least that's what it feels like. They still do you the courtesy of changing the color of this little arrow above your head so that you know when it's going to come. And just this small little change just makes it feel so much less frustrating. You can plan out your situation much better when the little arrow goes red above your head. If you felt like you needed to use a potion or just some sort of item to prepare, you have that ability to do that. And if you're trying to grind for battles, then you know exactly when you're going to get one. And again, it's just a small little change, but it's something that I really don't see essentially any game. Like I actually can't think off the top of my head about a game that conveys this information in such an elegant fashion. It's just as simple as the little arrow above your head changing color from blue when you know you're not even close to a battle, to yellow to indicate that a battle is on its way, and then finally red means you can get a battle at any moment now. Now, some of these dungeons are going to include these different puzzles. I mentioned the gravity-based puzzles, and there's also a lot of teleportation puzzles, which are really not my favorite, but they don't really get too difficult. There's a couple locations that implement this very rudimentary stealth system where you have to just time your approach so that you don't get caught by a wandering guard. And it's okay. I mean, it's nothing too spectacular, but it does do a little bit to help kind of mix up the monotony and have you forced to do something else. So in that regard, I think it's reasonable, but really not winning any awards as far as, dungeon exploration or interesting ideas go for sure when it comes to the different locations and the different little mechanics they're going to have you go through. I shouldn't forget to mention that there's a particular desert area towards the kind of later middle half of the game where it's very maze-like, and if you find yourself, you can easily find yourself back at the beginning or falling through quicksand to a lower level, which will pull you back to the beginning. And without a map that I found online, it would have been incredibly difficult to find my way through. So that's one additional section that's worth mentioning where they use some new mechanics that they don't really use elsewhere in the game, and I should not forget to talk about that. There are lots of chests scattered throughout the world, all over the place, whether you're in a village, a city, a palace, a dungeon, a forest, a cave, anywhere. You're going to find these chests all over the place, which I think is a good thing. However, it does kind of help support one of the more frustrating aspects of this game, which I will get into later when we're talking about inventory management. And those of you who have played this game know exactly what I'm talking about. When it comes to inventory management, there is a pretty major problem that I have with it. But as setting that aside for now, the idea that you're always on the lookout for chests, and some of them are extremely well hidden. Like you might not even see a pixel of them on the screen. You have to kind of know ahead of time where they are. I really like that about this kind of game. It means that no matter what screen you're on, it's worth it to keep your eyes open and look around in the different corners to explore and find these different chests, because some of them have really good gear and some of them have really good items that you're going to want to hold on to. So it's worth it to keep your eyes open, but we will talk about the frustrating aspects of that pretty soon here. Another thing worth mentioning when talking about exploration is stardust. And again, Legend of Dragoon veterans will know exactly what I'm talking about with the stardust. Now, in this playthrough that I did in order to create this video, my wife and I used a guide in order to help find all of the stardust. I knew going into it that there was stardust hidden everywhere, and my honest opinion is that if you don't use a guide, I cannot fathom how you will find all 50 stardust unless you spend insane amount of time wandering the map, clicking X on absolutely everything. There is a little bit of a pattern where if you see a fireplace, then there's kind of a higher chance you might find a stardust in there. But definitely not every fireplace, and definitely not every stardust is located in a fireplace. There are many locations where you would be surprised to find it. Even the first one, it's kind of hard to understand where it would be. So if you are doing a playthrough of this game and your goal is to find all 50 stardust, I highly recommend just using a guide. I'll link the one that we used below. I think it did a very good job keeping things reasonably spoiler free. Maybe not perfect, but it was a pretty good guide. I really liked it, and it definitely helped us find every single stardust. Now, the funny thing is, the reason why you want to find every single stardust is because it opens up a very difficult boss fight. That was the one thing in the entire game that Jane and I decided was not worth our time. So we spent all this time finding all the stardust, and then I didn't know what it was going to unlock. I just knew I wanted to find it all. And when I found out it unlocks like an incredibly difficult boss fight, I just did not want to put in the time to grind up and prepare myself for that fight. So that was the one thing we actually did not complete in this game. But luckily for us, the PlayStation 5 trophies did not include that boss fight as a trophy. So by the time we were done the game, we had 100% of the trophies, which is one of the first times I've ever fully, I guess you call that platinuming a game. It may be one of the first times I've ever done it, and I don't know that I feel like I truly deserve it. It's very surprising to me that this particular boss fight was not going to unlock a trophy, because it would have been a huge achievement for anybody who's beaten it. And again, if you know, you know. There were a handful of other side quests that were a lot more fun to do. There's one side quest where you can get one of Dart's most strong weapons in the game, and it's just kind of a different mechanical boss fight that was pretty fun to do. There's another side quest where you are tasked with defeating some of the spirits of the legendary dragoons from the past, and well, some of them might have been a little bit frustrating. I think the idea of the fight or the different fights was very cool. And again, the story behind it was actually really awesome, especially, with some of the characters and the potential connections they have with these old dragoon spirits. If the translation was a bit better, it could have been very emotional, a lot of this stuff. Instead, you just have to kind of understand, like, okay, yeah, these people have an emotional connection of some sort, and, it's supposed to be sad, or it's supposed to be bittersweet, or, they're happy that we finally got to kill this person. You have to input your own kind of understanding onto it, because again, the translation is not going to do a fantastic job. So there's a handful of side quests that are in the game, and we completed every one of them except for the one where we had to fight that incredibly difficult boss. I did actually go all the way over to that boss and attempt it, and with my first try, I just knew that I was not going to do it. The general consensus on the internet is, in order to complete this boss, you want to have 3 of the most expensive armor pieces in the game, and each armor piece costs 10,000 gold, and there just really is not a very good gold farming mechanic in this game. So we looked up these different methods. There's one supposed method where a particular overworld enemy has the ability to give you like 500 gold, but it also has the ability to party wipe your party. And, you can use like PlayStation 5 Rewind to try to avoid that, but that was just not something that I wanted to do. So we did think long and hard, because I wanted to try to complete like absolutely everything in the game, but we decided that this particular boss fight, which is Faust, by the way, if you're not a Legend of Dragoon veteran, then you might not know what I'm talking about, but there's a particular boss called Faust, and he is just incredibly difficult, and I just didn't want to spend all that time grinding just to complete that one boss. So unfortunately, that's one thing we left behind, but everything else was complete, and I walked away happy with that. Now, I did briefly touch on the overworld. So the overworld in Legend of Dragoon is very simple. It's basically a linear path. There are sometimes situations where you can take a fork in the road and go left or right. They try to be interesting with the visual design. Your little dotted path will go up and down some mountains or zigzag through different things, but it really is just a straight line. You can get into battles in the overworld, and I found that a lot of the enemies in the overworld were different from the enemies you're going to find in the different locations. And some of them required like throwing specific items at them to kill them, which I think is kind of interesting, but I found it quite difficult to get the items that you needed. Like, it just felt kind of luck-based. Maybe there's something I was missing there, so I didn't mess around too much with these overworld enemies, but it is something that you'll notice when you're playing the game. When you're in the overworld, there are particular birds and different types of enemies that you won't see in the actual dungeons that require special things to beat them. And when you do beat them, you're usually rewarded with either a lot of experience or maybe a lot of gold. But I just found it difficult to kind of farm that, so we didn't focus too much on that. Okay, so it's time to talk about probably the most interesting mechanic in Legend of Dragoon, and that is the addition or the battle system. And this is the one thing that I think most people will think about when they think about Legend of Dragoon. The addition system is, when you zoom out and you talk about it, It's not anything too special, but when you compare it to all these different JRPGs, especially from this era, it's actually very interesting. And the way it works is, depending on which character you're using, you're going to have something that the game calls an addition. It's basically just like a combo or a particular attack that you have set for that character. And depending on the difficulty of the addition, you have to press the X button in different timing in order to fully successfully land the attack. And if you fail, then you do much less damage. And in some cases, if you get counterattacked and if you fail to deal with the counterattack, you'll actually get pushed back and take damage yourself. Sometimes it's very easy to handle these counterattacks, but some of these additions, if you get countered, it feels like next to impossible to react in time to it, and it's very difficult. I found the addition system to be essentially the most fun part of the entire game. Depending on the characters that you're going to be keeping in your party, some of the additions are much more difficult, and some of them are much easier. There is one character, let's say character archetype, the bow and arrow user, that does not use additions. So I did not use them in my party. I tried to use them a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I found that the additions were just so much fun that I did not see a reason why I would not have an addition user in my party. On top of that, each time you successfully complete an addition, you give it 1 point towards leveling up. And when you level up your addition, it does more damage and it generates more SP. Now, some additions are meant to be like SP generators, and some additions are meant to do more damage. And some of them are a little mix of both. So you'll learn that as you play, which additions you want to use to be generating SP, or if you're just trying to dish out the most amount of damage, which addition should you be using to do that. SP, by the way, I think it stands for special points. To be fair, I don't actually even know, but that makes sense to me. Or maybe spirit points. But these are used to help you transform into a dragoon, which is something that you start incorporating into your battles maybe about a quarter of the way through. Maybe a little less than that. It doesn't take too long into the story before Dart learns how to transform into a dragoon, and then you get Rose, who already knows how to, and as you progress through the story, each and every character you get will eventually be able to transform into a dragoon. You need to gather SP in order to be able to turn into a dragoon, and the more times I believe the more times you transform or the more SP you gather, you will end up leveling up your dragoon level, which will allow you to stay in dragoon form for longer and also allow you to cast much more powerful dragoon spells. That's something that's worth noting. There is magic in the game, but only when you're in dragoon form, unless you're talking about consumable items which also do magic damage, and you can use them when you're in human form. But for the characters to actually cast magic themselves, they need to be in dragoon form in order to do that. The dragoon spells are worth commenting on. I found them to be insanely cool most of the time, although you can argue that the cutscenes take quite a while and there is no way to skip them. So by the time you get to the end of the game, you're probably going to be wishing that you could skip some of these cutscenes. But the truth is, you can tell the team creating these animations did not slouch on any of the magic spells. They all just are totally crazy and really epic, and it's really cool. Each time you learn a new dragoon spell, you're probably going to want to fire it off just to see what it looks like, because they definitely put a lot of effort and creativity into these spells. Even though it's a game from 1999 or 2000, it's still very fun to watch. The characters also shout out whatever the name of the spell is when it hits, and sometimes it's very funny, but it's cool. I give the voice acting a pass in the battle, which, by the way, same thing with your additions. The characters will shout out the name of the move when they land it, and it's just something that has been embedded in my brain ever since way back when I was a kid playing the game. I can easily hear Dart screaming volcano or Lavit screaming harpoon every time they land a hit. And if you've played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Again, the voice acting, maybe not absolutely fantastic, but in certain aspects of it, very memorable and a big part of the game. So I love the battle system, and I love the voice acting in the battles. I love the dragoon magic spells. I love the additions. And another thing I love that I haven't mentioned yet is the guard system, which is incredibly useful. So you have your attack that you can do. You have your items that you can consume, whether it's a healing item or a throwable consumable to do damage. You have your Dragoon transformation. And of course, you can flee from the battles as well. But an incredibly simple yet very useful mechanic is the guard mechanic. So every time a character uses guard, they heal automatically for 10% of their HP. And then they also half any incoming damage. On top of that, if that attack that was incoming was going to inflict some sort of ailment like poison or stun or fear or anything, if you are guarding it, you will avoid that affliction automatically. Those types of afflictions don't have a 100% hit rate, so if you were to not guard and get hit with a poison attack, it's not guaranteed that you'll be poisoned, but it is possible. But if you guard against it, then you will not. You will 100% block it, which is very useful. But even just using the healing mechanic from guard is very useful. Like, I did it all the time, all the way through to the end of the game. From the beginning of the game, there was always a situation where I could use guard to heal up a party member rather than using like a healing potion or something. Now, one last thing I'd like to talk about here in regards to the actual battles is a tie-in to a mechanic that I loved from the exploration section. The little yellow or the little colored arrows on top of your enemies do a fantastic job of letting you know how far along you are in the fight. Some RPGs will tell you 100% information, like this is how much HP that enemy has, this is how much HP this boss has, or maybe you have to cast like a specific spell like Libra or Scan or just something like that in order to see, okay, how much HP, what is their weakness, that kind of thing. In Legend of Dragoon, you can already inherently guess the enemy's weakness based on the color of their nameplate at the top. So the different elements will oppose each other, and if you hit with an opposing element, you will do extra damage, which is, understandable. It's pretty self-explanatory. But what I love, again, so much is just this simple color system that these arrows have. At the beginning of every battle, I was going to say mouse over, but you highlight an enemy, and it has a blue arrow over their head. And when you do 50% of their total health damage, that arrow will turn to yellow. And then when you get them to below 25%, that arrow will turn red. And it's such a simple thing, but it just feels like such an incredible way to give the player just enough information to let them know where they stand in the battle. Sometimes you're fighting a pretty particularly difficult boss, and it feels like you're hitting it forever and forever, and the arrow just keeps staying blue. But then finally, you see it turn yellow, and you realize, okay, we made it halfway, and you can alter your strategy based on that. Maybe you take a few extra attacks instead of guarding. Maybe this is when you want to transform into a Dragoon to do a big, powerful attack. Like, there's the information that you can get from just the little color above the enemy's head is incredibly important and helps shape your strategy for the fight. And they're not giving you full information. If you had full information, then you would know right from the start what to expect for the fight. But it's a perfect mix of telling you where you're at in the battle, how much HP do they have, but also at the beginning of the fight, not really knowing what you're up against. And I just love it. Again, it's a simple mechanic, but I think it just works so well, almost identically as beautiful as the exploration mechanic. And it's the same colors, the same arrow. It's just this one little thing that Dragoon does that I love so much, both in terms of exploration and in combat. And you just don't see it that much. Like, maybe there are games out there that do something similar, but I'm not thinking of them. And I wish more games did stuff like this, because a lot of times you're either getting full information or no information. And this is a beautiful mix of both that I think works incredibly well, and it's one of my favorite parts of the game. Okay, so next up we're going to talk about the item system, at least in regards to battles. The items that you can use in battle are, for the most part, pretty self-explanatory. You have these healing items that work just as you would expect, although one difference is that Dragoon does things on a percentage basis. So the cool thing about this is that you don't have to have like 15 different kinds of potions. You don't have to have potion, high potion, max potion, hyper potion, X potion. Obviously I'm ragging on Final Fantasy here, but with Dragoon, there's like 2 types of potions. Well, you can say 4 types total, as far as healing goes, because you have either a healing potion, which will do, I think it's 50% of your health, or you can have a healing fog, which will do 100% of your health. You can have a healing breeze, which will do 50% of all your party's health, so an AoE heal, or a healing rain, which will be 100% of all your party's health. Very useful item. There are some items you can use to refill your MP. There's Angel's Prayer that you can use to resurrect a party member. And there's a few other, restorative items like that. But they also have magic items that I've touched on already that you throw at your enemy. And some of them require you to mash on the X button in order to gain more power out of it. And this is a way that you can use characters like Shauna or maybe Meru. In fact, I used Rose quite often for these kinds of items to do a little bit of magic damage. Some enemies you face are really weak against magic, so you can use these items to do that kind of thing. And we'll talk more about the inventory management because this is where it gets a little bit annoying, but these consumables are quite useful for doing damage if you're the type of person to use items in battle, which, to be fair, for me personally, I would much rather just use an addition. I focused a lot more on physical damage with my characters, but there were definitely situations where I needed to use items. Another thing we can talk about here are repeat items, which I found to be a little bit confusing to understand at first, but then once you understand, you realize, oh, okay, this is what a repeat item is, which totally makes sense in hindsight. There's an item you can get called the Psychedelic Bomb, which is a repeat item. There is a speed up repeat item, a speed down repeat item, and there's a power up repeat item as well. And there might be a defensive one. I can't remember right now. But these are repeat items. And the idea behind them is that you can use them once in each battle, but you always get them back at the end of the battle, so you can use in the next battle. Very useful, by the way, against like just random enemies, like random battles that you'll fight, but particularly useful against bosses because they allow you to power up your party to do some big damage in a window of time against some of these bosses. Or one thing that is really important is actually lowering the speed of the bosses, because some of these bosses in Dragoon have such an incredible level of speed that they will be moving 2 or 3 times before any of your characters get to move. And sometimes they're casting these like big spells that have long cutscenes, and they'll just do one after the other, and it can actually feel very unfair because they're just pounding you with these heavy attacks. And then you get to go like once or twice, and then they're just back on it again, smacking you with these huge attacks. So a speed down for a situation like that is incredibly useful, and especially combined with a speed up, allowing you to just get lots of attacks in. Very good and needed for a lot of these boss fights. The Psychedelic Bomb in general also is an incredible weapon because I think it does non-elemental damage and it does massive damage, especially if you can boost it up to like 200%. You're going to be doing incredible damage with this. Unfortunately, just once per battle, but it's enough to swing the fight. I can't tell you the amount of boss fights I was at where it felt like they were in blue forever. I hit them with the Psychedelic Bomb and bring them to yellow, and I'm telling you, it changes your mental state at that point when you realize, okay, I've got them underneath yellow now. I know I'm getting close to killing them, and the Psychedelic Bomb was really good for doing that. Most of these items you're going to find, by the way, through enemy drops. You can purchase them in stores, or they're going to be littered around in all these different chests scattered all throughout the world. And again, we'll talk about the inventory management soon. The next thing I want to cover, though, is the armor, the different armor and weapon builds that you can actually mess around with in Legend of Dragoon. When you first start playing, and probably for the first chapter, maybe even all the way through to the second chapter, really, the battles are very easy, and you really don't have to do much thinking. You just use your additions, especially if you're good at landing them. You just use them, and you'll be able to get through probably like the first half of the game. At some point, though, you're going to start realizing that there are bosses that do particular attacks, like can't combat attacks, that will just essentially one-hit kill a party member, or they're using a specific element, or maybe you want to be generating SP faster or generating MP faster. There are all these different weapon or armor types in the game that help you to kind of build a specific strategy. And one that comes to mind for me is I was trying to use Meru. It didn't end up working, by the way, but I gave it a serious try. I kept putting her in the party because I wanted to have like a magic caster. So I did this thing with Meru where every time she got hit, she gained MP, which essentially would allow her to cast her spells more often. And because she's like a magic focused character, I was trying to do AoE damage with her, but also she had an AoE heal as well. So it made sense, like she would be regenerating MP, because it's not so easy to actually regenerate MP in Dragoon. You have to use items for that in general, or rest at an inn. So having it happen automatically each time she got hit, I thought was a pretty cool idea. You can have different weapons that will apply different status effects, like a character's particular element, or maybe fear, or even instant death. So you can mess around with that. There are these different accessories that you can use, and I mentioned how some bosses have these like can't combat attacks that will totally wipe out a character. You can wear talismans that are meant specifically to avoid that from happening. But the sad thing about that is that's the only benefit you get. So you're giving up a different advantage just so that you can't get one hit killed by this like particular move that the boss might not even use on you. So you have to be careful with how you're building your party. You can't just have a talisman on all the time, because I'd say probably only 5% of the enemies in the game even use these can't combat attacks. So you have to kind of know what you're up against. One thing I will say for sure, though, is that the therapy ring is the best ring in the game. The therapy ring behaves kind of like guard. It does not have incoming damage or prevent, poison or any of these status ailments. But what it does do is automatically give you 10% of your HP every time it's that character's turn. And there are 2 of them in the game, and I had both of them equipped. I put one on Lavitz and Albert, and then I put another one on Dart. And I just, for the most part, never changed it unless I felt like I really needed a talisman. The therapy ring is so good, especially when you decide that you actually will guard, because now you're getting 20% of your health back in just one turn, and it's really easy to keep those characters topped up, especially when you give them a helmet, let's say, that gives them a lot more HP, so that percentage is so much higher. Therapy ring is incredible, and I had 2 of them on for the end of the game, and I never really looked back. All right, so let's talk a little bit about each particular character in regards to combat. There are 7 characters in the game. Dart is the main character. He's basically your all-rounder, although I feel like he has a bit of a benefit towards physical damage and physical defense. You have Lavitz, who is later replaced by Albert, and this guy is a really heavy physical attacker with good physical defense. You put a therapy ring on him, and you give him the dragon helm that gives him more HP, and you're happy. We have Rose, who is kind of like a balanced character. She does a little bit more magic damage and a little less health and defense, but more physical damage than some of the other kind of magic users. So she's kind of well-rounded as well, but maybe a little bit more leaning towards magic. You have Hashel, who I didn't really give much of a chance. I think out of all the characters, Hashel is the one that probably I would have liked more if I tried using him more. We'll talk a little bit about that soon as well, but Hashel is like a physical damage dealer. He uses his fists. He's like a martial artist, and he has some pretty cool additions, but I didn't really give him as much of a chance as I kind of wish I did. I've already touched on Meru. Meru is kind of like a magic-focused character. She does do a little bit of physical defense or physical damage, but she's very, very squishy and very easy to kill. So it was very difficult to keep her in the party because she would just get 1 or 2 shot, or she gets hit one time and you feel like you need to just heal her up every single time. And I just didn't have that much fun with her in the end, but I did give her a try, and she has some cool magic, to be fair. We have Kongol, who is kind of similar to Lavitz and Albert, although even more extreme. Incredibly powerful defense and physical attacks, incredibly weak against magic. Also a pretty cool character, and one that I think probably was powerful enough to fit in my party. The only thing about Kongol is that his additions were a little bit boring, and his character in general was a little bit boring, and we're going to talk more about the story aspect as well. He was not more fun to use than Lavitz or Albert. He ended up sitting on the bench most of the time. And then finally, we have Shauna, who is later replaced by Miranda. And I mentioned how these people are bow users, so they are very boring in combat. They do very little damage with their bow. If you're the type of person who really doesn't like additions, though, and you would much rather be throwing magic items at the enemies, then that's what this character is here for. They have really high magic. They have healing as well when they're in Dragoon form. So they're very good at magic and healing, but they're also very squishy. And again, they have no additions. They just shoot a bow, which I found to be pretty boring. There was a couple times where, again, I had this like feeling like I wasn't using enough of my party. So I was trying to fit in these different characters and try to level them up a little bit. But every time I put Shanna in, or Meru, or Miranda, I just felt like I was playing the game on hard mode, because they get hit one time, and if they're not dead, they're almost dead, and they're not really doing a lot of damage. So by the time I realized I was just going to stick to one party, that's basically what I did until the end of the game, but not without lack of trying. I did try to level up some of these other characters, which brings me very nicely into this next criticism that I have with the game. And I think this might be a little bit of a controversial opinion, because, there's other games that have come out recently that have complained about the amount of times players are forced to have particular party compositions. And in Legend of Dragoon, to my memory, there are two different situations where you are forced to have a party member in your team. One of them is very early on, and then the other one is also like pretty early on. I think both of them might even be in Chapter 1. Maybe the other one's in Chapter 2. I can't remember. But beyond that, besides this one small situation in the end game, you're essentially able to use whatever character you want, which makes it so that at least what happened to me was I ended up building this dream team of Dart, Albert, or Lavitz, and Rose. And I had really no incentive to change that, because when I did try to change it, the characters were very weak, and I felt like I was playing the game on hard mode, so I ended up just resorting back to my dream team. I feel like if the game implemented more situations in the story where you were forced to use Shauna, or Meru, or Kongol, or Hashel. There's one moment where you are forced to use Hashel, but it's like for 5 minutes and then it goes away. I feel like that would have been better for the game, because then you would have been forced to try these characters' additions, forced to keep them up to a reasonable level with the rest of the party, and it just would have given you more variety with your party. And yeah, to be fair, I had the ability to change the party whenever I wanted, so I understand that the imbalance that was created with my party was essentially my fault, but I tried to mix it up. And as I've said a few times now, every time I tried that, it felt like I was being punished for it. I could easily just go through the entire game with Dart, Albert, and Rose and not have any complaints, other than I feel like I'm not using any of my other characters. So that was just one small thing that I wish the game did a little bit more. There could have been many different story beats where you were forced to have Shauna in your party, or Meru, or Kongol. And then that way you would be forced to try out their additions, level them up a bit, use their Dragoon magic, because I did not unlock every single Dragoon spell. I'm certain that I missed out on quite a few awesome spells that maybe I wouldn't have if I was forced into this party diversity thing. But I understand that some people absolutely hate it when games do that. So this is more of a personal thing for me. I would have had more fun with the party if we were forced to use the different characters a little bit more often. Instead, I seriously think there's two situations where you are forced to have someone, and there's never a situation where Dart is not in the party, by the way. So Dart is always forced to be in the party, which means by default, he's going to be your highest level character. He's going to be your guy that you're getting up to Dragoon level 5, and there's really nothing you can do about that, which I suppose is fine. He's the main character, but it just makes it very, like, everyone's going to have a pretty similar experience having Dart in their party the entire time. Okay, before we get into the story segment of the game and the characters, I'm going to talk about maybe one of the biggest complaints I have with Legend of Dragoon. And maybe I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. To be totally fair, by the time I got to the end of the game, I was just so used to it that I got over it somewhat. But I will say that using a guide that was telling me what item was in every chest definitely helped to alleviate against this problem. The inventory management for consumable items in Legend of Dragoon is incredibly frustrating. You are limited to a maximum of 32 consumable items at a time. You can have unlimited weapons, unlimited armor, unlimited of the same longsword in your gear tab, I guess. But when it comes to consumables, you have a limit of 32. And there are like 3,200 chests out in the world. And every time you find a chest, if your consumables are maxed out, you click on that chest and it's going to tell you you don't have any room for that item. It's not going to tell you what the item is. So you're going to have this feeling like, shit, I got to go into my inventory. I have to either drop something or I have to use a healing item just so I can free up space so I can see what's in here. Only to find out that it's like a burnout or like some minor magic item or some minor healing item or maybe one of the best magic spells in the game. You really have no idea unless you're following a guide about what is in these chests, and you are going to be forced to be going into your menu consistently. And yes, the music is really good in the menu, but it sucks when you have to always be going into your inventory and discarding items just to see what was in the chest. And it's probably not even an item you want. Having the guide helped so that you can be like, okay, it's not even worth doing that for this chest, but it's just incredibly frustrating. And it doesn't take long at all before you're in this world. Maybe halfway through chapter 1 and you're already full on your inventory and then just having issues with these chests. Now, if you are using Shauna a lot and if you're throwing all these magic items at enemies a lot, maybe you're not going to have the same problem I had, okay? I've already talked about how much I like the additions, and every time I used an item was basically an addition that I didn't get to use. So that's a me thing, and probably a lot of other people, I'm willing to bet. But if you're the type that's always using these consumable items, then fine, maybe you won't have this problem. It feels like the idea, this is my counter argument to my own frustration. This is what I think they might have been going for. I think they wanted you to have like a particular consumable loadout. And that's essentially what I ended up resorting to. I told myself, okay, I always want to have 3 healing fogs. I want to have 3 healing breezes. I want to have 3 angel prayers, like 2 mind purifiers, 2 body purifiers, a couple magic regenerating items. And then the rest of it was like whatever magic spells I had room for. Also, and my repeatable items as well that needed to be in there. So I can see a situation, like I ended up doing just kind of naturally was coming up with that loadout. I was like, okay, this is what I always want. I want 3 of this, 3 of that, 2 of this. And then maybe I have some room to pick up some of these items along the way. And, you know, I suppose you can make an argument for that being like a somewhat interesting system. It would have been better if you could see what the item was that was in the chest. You know, another thing that happens in this game is when you finish a random battle, they will drop items like this as well. At least it'll show you what the item was, and you can decide, do you just want to discard immediately, or do you want to pick it up and discard something else? That is less annoying. It still is kind of annoying, but much less when you know the item that you're working with. It's just so annoying when you see a chest and you're in the late game and you're like, man, I don't know what this item is. It could be something really good. So you go into your inventory, you throw something away, and you pick it up, and it's just some lame, like, fire spell that you're never going to use. And then maybe you would have used that item that you threw away, you know? So it's just something that I wish was much better than it was. And it's funny because they let you hold on to unlimited gear. So clearly it's not like a system issue. Like, they could have let you have unlimited items, but they clearly made this decision as like a, you know, some sort of balance for the difficulty, and maybe if you could have unlimited items, it would be much more difficult. I don't know, but it's just something that I had to talk about. It kicks in very early, and it frustrates you throughout the rest of the game, unless you're using a guide, which is telling you what is in every chest, and then finally you don't really have to worry about it that much. So that's the inventory management rant out of the way. I really did not like it, and I just wanted to say that. Okay, so now at this point of the video, we are starting to approach the actual character and plot developments in the game. Maybe I've already spoiled something slightly in the previous part of this video, but now definitely we're going to go into some pretty major spoiler territory and talk about the different characters that you get and what actually happens in this game. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I found this to be the most difficult part of this video. Talking about the story is, I just find, very hard. And that's not really the game's fault. It's a long JRPG, and I don't want this video to be an entire breakdown of every single story beat in the game. It's difficult to figure out what is worth leaving in and what should I leave out. So I did something that some people are going to think is pretty heinous, but I just feel like it was the best idea I can come up with, and when we get there, we'll get there. But first, what I wanted to talk about is the pacing. I think that the pacing of Legend of Dragoon, despite everything I just said, the pacing is very, very good in this game, especially Chapter 1, and then probably especially parts of Chapter 4. Actually, there are parts of Chapter 4 that the pacing kind of grinds to a halt, but they're like very specific parts, and then once things get going again, they really get going, and I think it's very good. Particularly Chapter 1, though, the game starts off with a bang, and you have a immediate quest that you need to do, and you do that quest, and then you have something else immediately that you have to do, and you do that, and it just keeps pushing you forward, and there's always something to do, and there's little spots here and there where they'll slow it down to let you explore a town, like when you explore Bale, you can take some time to meet Lavitz's mom and some character development, but then immediately right after that, you're back into the main quest, and you're moving forward, and things are happening, and you're becoming a Dragoon, and then Shanna's getting sick, and then blah, 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 blah. So it just feels like there's always something going on, and it's really good in that manner, in my opinion. There are some parts of the game where it's a little bit slower, but for the most part, the pacing is very, very good, and especially at the beginning. Now, I'm going to do my best to give an overall plot description, and I came up with this idea at the last moment because this is like the second or third time I've been trying to record the plot description specifically, and I either end up rambling way too much, getting too many things wrong, losing my spot in where I'm at, and it's just hard to do. So I came up with this brilliant idea to pull up ChatGPT and ask it to provide me with a succinct description of the entire plot of Legend of Dragoon. And to be fair, I can't deny it's doing a better job than what I would do. So I'm going to read it, and I'm going to input my own little things here and there because I can't help but do that. I just want you to know I'm not a ChatGPT hater, but I'm not a ChatGPT lover either. And I'm not going to get into the habit of incorporating this kind of thing. But this just felt like the easiest way for me to do it. So just bear with me, and you can hate on me in the comments if you really want. So here we go. The Legend of Dragoon follows the journey of Dart Feld, a young warrior seeking revenge against the Black Monster who destroyed his hometown and killed his parents when he was just a child. Along the way, Dart meets companions such as Shauna, Lavitz, Rose, and others who join him on his quest. As Dart delves deeper into his quest for vengeance, he uncovers a larger conspiracy involving the ancient Winglies, a powerful race with magical abilities. The story explores themes of friendship, betrayal, sacrifice, and the struggle between good and evil. Throughout the game, Dart and his allies confront various adversaries, including the mysterious Lloyd, who seeks powerful artifacts known as the Moon and Divine Moon Objects. These objects hold the key to unlocking immense power and reshaping the world. As the plot unfolds, players discover the true identity of the Black Monster, the secrets of Dart's past, and the role of the Dragoon spirits, which grant power to the Dragoons to chosen warriors. The narrative culminates in a climactic battle against the forces of darkness and the ultimate showdown to save the world from destruction. So, yeah, I mean, you can't deny this is a pretty brief explanation of the plot, and it actually does a pretty good job avoiding spoilers. I'm going to talk about some of these spoilers as we round out this video, because I also want to go into what some of my favorite moments were in the game, and some of them are going to be pretty spoiler heavy for sure. However, before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about the character development, because some of these characters are very, very good, and some of them are very, very weak. Let's start with the weak ones and build up. We have Haschel. Haschel is an old kind of pervy man, and his whole deal is that he knew Dart from the past when Dart was going to hunt for the Black Monster, and Haschel had helped him out a little bit, but then they got separated. And Haschel's whole backstory is that he was very hard on his daughter. He was trying to teach his daughter to be a professional martial artist, and she was pretty good at it, but didn't seem to care about it as much as he did. They ended up getting into a heated fight, and she just runs away, and now he's on a quest to try to find her. As far as I know, that's basically it. That's all it is. And at the end of the game, there's a section where you have to play as each particular party member solo. So I mentioned this before. There's one spot where you are forced to control each different party member, and they kind of confront their past. And in doing this for Haschel, he actually fights his daughter. And it's a very weird kind of demonic version of his daughter. And he basically needs to beat the demon out of her, which is strange and not very thought-provoking in my opinion. I thought it was kind of lame. And eventually he beats the demon out of her. And it's not even her, by the way. It's like a figment of her in this like imagination land. And then as he does that, he wins the fight, and he just seems to be okay with how things went. You don't ever really know where his daughter is. He just kind of gets over it. So really not a lot of character stuff there. Now, next we have Kongol, which is probably even worse. Kongol is the last remaining Gigantos on the planet, and you can do a lot of interesting stuff with that, but instead he just serves as like a background kind of dummy, powerful brute that you have on your team. You know, he does have some good stuff with Emperor Dole and how Dole saved him, so he devoted his life to Dole, but then he realized Dole was going down the wrong path, so he kind of switches sides and helps Dart after Dart beats his ass a couple times. And, you know, he's got that going for him, but really ever since that, he just kind of stands on the side. And there's even several scenes where they don't even bother to give him a real 3D character model. They just put his pixels on the screen, and he's not even he's not even like a 3D model. He feels like the one who has the least character development for sure. Next up, we have Meru. Meru is a Wingly, so there is some interesting stuff there. She was excommunicated from her Wingly village because the Winglies hate humans, but Meru never really hated humans. She was more interested in them and wanted to learn more about them. So she leaves her Wingly village and kind of joins the humans, but nobody knows she's a Wingly. I thought her character development was kind of good. And she goes back to confront the Winglies and try to win them back over. And they play a role in, you know, winning at the end and do a lot for Dart and his friends to kind of help him out. But after, you know, some conflict and stuff. So there's some good stuff with Meru. Not as bad as Haschel and Kongol, in my opinion. Next up, we have Miranda. And this is tough to talk about. Miranda replaces Shauna, okay? So I suppose I should talk about Shauna first. Shauna is an incredibly important character to the story because she is the Moonchild. She's like the other chosen one. She's a descendant of royalty, and she doesn't know that. And she's been destined to be the Moonchild. So there's all sorts of plot development that goes into her. And she has a connection with these Virages, which are kind of like Wingly monsters. And, you know, every time she's around a Virage, she has these like premonitions, and it's strange stuff. But several times in the game, she gets sick and kind of passes out and needs to be saved. Well, what happens towards the end is she has this like major thing happen to her where she goes into a coma and she just can't battle anymore. And eventually she gets captured by, the big bad guy at the end, and she just can't be part of your party. So what the game does is they just introduce Miranda. And maybe within 10 minutes of even meeting Miranda decides she's going to join your party. You don't really know anything about her, but she inherits everything that Shauna had. She inherits Shauna's Dragoon spirit and her bow, and she has all the same abilities. So she's basically just a Shauna replacement. But they don't give you any time to get to know her. Later on, her big story beat is that she's had a problem with her mother in the past. Her mother abandoned her so that she can have a better life. And it was kind of a bitchy thing to do for her mother to do that. So Miranda kind of just hates her mom. And that's her whole thing. You know, she is like a sacred sister, and she has all this other stuff that they could have focused a little bit more on, but they just didn't really give her that much time. And because she's not an addition user, I didn't really use her in combat all that much. So Miranda was kind of like a weird question mark for me. And yeah, that's Miranda really. She just really didn't have a lot of stuff going on. Shauna, being the Moonchild, being Dart's love interest, by the way, is something I should bring up. They do this in like kind of a, depending on how you look at it, it's either like cutesy or it's kind of cringe, and it's probably somewhere in the middle. But because it's an older game and because the translation sucks so much, if you give it the benefit of the doubt and just try to imagine that it's maybe a little better written, it's kind of cute, the little thing she has going on with Dart, and Dart being a dumbass, not understanding that she's like a adult woman now and that they could have a relationship. He kind of does the whole like, I look at you as like my little sister thing, and she doesn't like that. And eventually they get over it, and they end up happily ever after. But really, it's I don't know. I kind of like it overall. And there's actually one moment at the end of chapter 2 where they finally kiss, and it's like a super happy moment. And it actually, I think they did that moment pretty well. So yeah, anyway, that's Shauna and Miranda. Next up is a mix of one of my favorite characters and then a mix with kind of like an okay character. So Dart meets Lavitz pretty early on, and Lavitz teams up with Dart and they help to break Shauna out of the prison. And they immediately become like bros. And the bromance is real, like right from the start. They become like best friends. They're soldiers. They know each other because they're men, and they do men stuff like swing swords and spears and kill bandits and all this shit. So they end up just like really forming a bond. And it actually makes Shauna jealous at one point because like she wants to have that same bond with Dart, but she doesn't know. She doesn't understand how can like men just like bond like that. So they're bros like right from the start. Lavitz takes Dart home to meet his mom and all of this, and then to meet King Albert, who Lavitz is under. And it's a lot of good stuff. Like I think Lavitz is an incredible character, and beyond just being a bro, he's also a really brave soldier. He's got honor and integrity, and he always tries to do what's right, and he'll sacrifice his life for the greater good, and all this kind of heroic stuff. So he's a really good character. Something happens, which I'll talk about, and then he ends up getting replaced by Albert. And Albert is the king of Basel, and apparently just kind of leaves his kingly duties behind to join the party and go off on an adventure to save the world. Albert is kind of like a nerdy guy. He's very smart. He's very good with words, as good as he can be in this game. And he's like a king, right? So he's kind of like a scholar, and very nerdy. As far as this character goes, he's okay. He doesn't do anything egregious that I really hate. In battle, he's a beast. I love using Albert and Lavitz in battle with their spear and their crazy additions. So I love them in that regard. And beyond that, he's okay. All right, I already talked a lot about Dart. Dart being kind of like the general main protagonist. He's a little bit blockheaded when it comes to women, but he has his heart in the right place. He's an honorable guy. He's bros with Lavitz. It's hard to really say, much about him, except for his entire quest to kill the Black Monster, which actually is pretty interesting. The Black Monster, as stated below by ChatGPT, thank you, killed his family. So Dart went on a lifelong quest to kill the Black Monster, which makes sense. And, that's his whole thing. The only thing he really wants to do is kill the Black Monster. And if he can save the world on the way, then great. But really, he just wants to kill the Black Monster. And as far as I know, that's essentially it. Besides this cute little stuff with Shauna, his bromance with Lavitz, and his desire to kill the Black Monster, that's kind of the biggest things about Dart that you'll really need to know about. Then we talk about Rose and the final character. Rose is, in my opinion, the best character in the whole game. And Rose has an incredibly interesting backstory. She is like 11,000 years old, but you wouldn't know it just from looking at her. She is one of the original Dragoons from the Dragoon campaign. And she's managed to stick around this entire time because she also has a lifelong mission. She is the Black Monster, which creates a very interesting dynamic with her and Dart because they don't fall in love together, But Rose is very fond of Dart because Dart reminds her heavily of her lover from 11,000 years ago, who happens to be Dart's father. Yeah, it gets kind of confusing, and this is why I'm saying it's hard to talk about. But Dart really reminds Rose of Zieg, who is Dart's father, who was also one of the legendary dragoons from 11,000 years ago. But Rose is on a mission to kill the Moonchild because every time she kills the Moonchild, she stops the evil antagonist from being able to enact his plan, which is to kidnap the Moonchild and essentially use her to destroy the world. It's a very simple way to put it, but that's pretty much what it is. And the stuff that Rose has been through and the stuff that Rose has had to do, and the fact that she knows how much Dart hates the Black Monster, but she is the Black Monster and he doesn't know that. I just found that to be a really incredible kind of dynamic between the two. And she's a very interesting character. And then to top it all off, at the end of the game, she finally sacrifices her life so that she can finally die. And she does it to help save everybody else. She goes out like a hero and she essentially saves the entire world by sacrificing her own life doing it. And it's very touching. The voice acting basically ruins it all, but it's it's still a pretty good ending for Rose. And I just think that Rose is by far the most interesting character in the whole game. She's got a very interesting backstory. She's got a really like kind of aloof and let's just say kind of bitchy attitude towards everything, but you can understand why. She's been around for 11,000 years, and the only reason why is so that she can like save the world. And people tend to not like her because she's kind of a bit of a bitch sometimes. But anyway, I love Rose and I love her character essentially from start to finish. And yeah, she's my favorite character. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about our favorite moments and then some of our least favorite moments. We're going to talk about the actual boss fight at the end, and then we're going to start wrapping things up. So we're getting kind of close to the end here. First off, my favorite moment, or at least one of my favorite moments, is when Lavitz gives his life. By accident, actually. He doesn't necessarily do it on purpose. But there's a huge mission where you have to go back to Helena prison to save Albert because the prison warden kind of kidnapped Albert and is kind of using him as bait to bait everybody in. And Albert also happens to have the moon dagger. I think it's a moon dagger. It's a moon item, and I'm pretty sure it's a moon dagger. So Lloyd wants to steal the moon dagger from Albert, and they take him prisoner. And Lavitz is a hero. He's like, fuck this, I'm going back to save Albert. And this is where you have to have Lavitz in your party, which of course you're going to have him in your party anyway, because who else are you going to use? You're not going to use Shauna, you're going to use Lavitz because he's a bro. So he's in the party. He does all this cool badass shit, jumping into the prison and like just being a hero. And then you find Albert at the top, and Lloyd is there, and Lavitz just loses his shit on Lloyd. He jumps into the air, turns into a dragoon, and charges in. And then Lloyd just kills him with this like dragon buster sword. Just kills him in one hit. And Lavitz is dead. And you've had a reasonable amount of time getting to know Lavitz. And, you know, if you're me, you like him a lot. He's like one of the good characters. And now he's just dead. And he ends up getting replaced by Albert. And in the same way that Miranda replaces Shauna, he gets all of his stats and his weapons and his dragon spirit. But the moment was done very well where Lavitz dies trying to rescue Albert. And it's one of my favorite moments. One moment that Jane really liked was when Albert and the Princess of Fetz, I think, or Feltz, get married. And there's a spot where you kind of save this princess. She's been captured by a bandit queen or something, and she's been hidden in a painting and impersonated by someone else. And it's a whole plot, and you unravel it and you save the princess. And then you can tell kind of right away that Albert and the princess are like attracted to each other. There's even a part where like you're trying to round everybody up, and Dart is finding all the party members, and he finds Albert and he's with her. And it just seems like he's kind of like, he's like, come on, Albert, I need you to come do like save the world stuff. And Albert is like, come on, man, I just want like 5 minutes with this girl. And it's kind of cute. And at the end of the game, you see that they get married, and Jane thought that it was a cute little moment. which I did as well. Next up is when you find out that Rose is the Black Monster, which there is a lot of foreshadowing for this. And, when I was going through the game this time, that was something that I had already known. I can't remember how I knew it, but I was spoiled in some way. I knew that Rose was the Black Monster the whole time, but Jane didn't. And there are moments that there's foreshadowing, like when you're on the ghost ship and the ghosts are attacking only Rose and not anybody else. And they're saying like they're protecting the princess and all this. So there is foreshadowing for sure. But if you didn't know what to expect and then you find out all of a sudden Rose is the Black Monster and Dart goes a little bit crazy because he's like, what the fuck? Like my whole life goal was to kill the Black Monster. It's a really good moment. And it just kind of solidifies Rose as one of the more interesting characters in the game. Next up, there's a spot towards the end where you meet Lavitz, his spirit. You're in the city of dead, and there's all these dead spirits around, and one of them happens to be Lavitz's spirit, and he's been taken over by this demon. And you actually have to fight Lavitz in a boss fight. And it's a pretty easy boss fight. It's pretty fun to go through, though. And then when you finally kill the boss, Lavitz is... he's there. Like, it's actually him. And they have one final kind of send-off, one conversation between Lavitz, Dart, and Albert, and they do like the brofist thing, and it's a very touching moment, and one of my favorite moments in the game that I had to bring up in this section. I kind of touched on this one as well, but the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 2, you do kind of a lot of running around. Dart needs to get his Dragoon spirit back because he loses it, and this is where the pacing kind of falters a little bit because you're looking for Lloyd, and Lloyd is nowhere to be found. So instead of actually looking for Lloyd, you're doing like side quests for all these different villages in this new country. But by the time you get to the end and you finally find out where Lloyd is, and you've saved the princess and you've fixed everything and everybody's problems and everybody's getting married, there's this kind of feast or party in the palace at the end where Shauna gets all dressed up and they have their little moment and the music is all happy and Dart finally gives her a kiss and it's all like it feels like it's like the happiest moment in the game before shit starts to go down, And it was a really nice ending to Chapter 2, which just stood out to me as one of my favorite moments in the game. I remember when I was done with it, I was just thinking like, man, that was just a really happy feeling and I can't wait for the game to ruin it. And not because the game is bad, but because it's going to, shit's going to start getting real and depressing. And then finally, at the absolute end of the game, right through the end of the credits, there's a little moment where you've been following this bird and he's kind of watching. He's like, oh, this is what Haschel's doing. This is what Kongel's doing. This is what Albert's doing. And he's going and seeing what everybody's doing. And it gives you kind of that closure at the end of the game. You're seeing how all the characters are moving on with their lives once the final quest has been fully completed. After all of that, the bird finds this spot to just kind of float in and rest. And it's at the same spot where you kill the final boss at the end. And there's these two dragon eggs, and there's a red one and a dark one. I guess it's probably purple, but it's the dark one for Rose. And it's implied that it's Zeke's Dragoon spirit and Rose's Dragoon spirit. And they're just kind of sitting there pulsing because this is the spot where they sacrifice their life to kill the final boss finally and save the world. And it's just a nice little moment. Like I wasn't expecting that to happen. And when I saw it happen, both Jane and I both thought it was like a really nice touch to end the game. So we chose to add it in our favorite moments. Okay, let's talk a little bit about our least favorite moments. The City of Law was a very frustrating section towards the end of the game in Chapter 4 where it had you going back and forth through these different stealth sections that were kind of difficult. Not really difficult, but just tedious. And you have to like go and in order to pass a law, you have to go find the law and then you have to send the law through like a process so that it can be scanned by the law scanners. And then you have to take it from there and bring it over to the approval station where they have to approve it. And then you have to take it over to the activation station where it actually activates. And you have to do this a couple different times. And it was just very annoying and tedious and I hated it. And it's in my least favorite moments. The other one is Haschel's story, which to be fair, I've already kind of touched on. I felt like Haschel, like they just phoned in his entire story. It's like they tried to give him an important story with his missing daughter and all that, but then they just kind of made him fight an imaginary demon version of his daughter, and then that's just how it ended. Like, it would have been better to just give him the Kongol treatment and just give him like no backstory, and it would have been better than having like this kind of like shitty wrap up. I just didn't really like Haschel's story. I think he was a cool combat character, but was not really a fan of his story. And actually, touching on that as well, I mentioned before how towards the end of the game, each character has like a closing moment where you're supposed to you're controlling only that character, and you're going through their like last story moment, and it's supposed to kind of tie them up and give you closure. And most of them just fell very flat. Not all of them. It was kind of neat with Rose, again, because Rose is the best character, how she was like fighting her old dragon, or you know, Kongol was kind of okay fighting his brother, but you don't really know anything about his brother the whole time, so it just kind of shoves it on you in this one moment. And you can see why a game like this would want to have like an interesting closing moment for each of the NPCs in your party, but it just kind of felt rushed, and maybe one or two of them were good, but most of them really weren't that good. So one of my least favorite moments in the game. And then one last thing we touched on here was the amount of gold farming that was necessary to kill Faust and how difficult Faust was. I can see if you're like 15 years old and you have a PlayStation 1 and you have like 3 games total, and one of them is Legend of Dragoon, then maybe you would want to spend like 2 weeks just farming up gold so that you can buy the things that you need to fight Faust. But I don't have time for that. I would have much rather there be a little bit of a better gold farming system. I don't care if you save it right till the end of the game. It just felt like it was impossible to really farm gold very well. And because of that, I did not want to complete that quest. And that's why I added it to my least favorite moments. It just felt like if I wanted to fight Faust, I would have had to designate like a week of my life to farming up just to be strong enough to maybe kill him. And I didn't like that. So one of my least favorite moments. Now, from least favorite moments, let's talk about one of the coolest moments in the game, in my opinion, which is the final boss. And it's always good when the final boss is one of the coolest moments in the game. One thing I really like that this game did with the final boss is they made him very tanky, and they gave him lots of different phases. I think there's actually 4 phases to the fight. But they did not make him too difficult. You know, they made him tanky, so it took a lot of attacks to kill him, but he didn't have that insane speed that Faust has, or those insanely damaging abilities. I found the fight to be incredibly well balanced, and just very, very fun. It had amazing music and a really cool system where like each time you killed a certain phase, the boss would transition into like a different era of the I don't know, history of the world, basically. And it's hard to explain without seeing it. Hopefully I'm showing you some footage in the background, but there's some really interesting stuff going on here. The boss itself is like wacky as hell. Like there's one part where he looks like a big mushroom or something, and then another part where he looks like a rocket ship. And this is supposed to be like the god of the world. So it's very strange, very JRPG like, but it was a really fun fight because you get to use, you know, your strongest abilities and stick in there with him for quite a while. The music is really good. The transitions are very interesting. And you get to use the Divine Dragon as well, with some really cool, like, reminds me of Xenoblade Chronicles, kind of. Very, I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I just found him to be kind of looking like that. And you get this, like, Divine Blaster Cannon and stuff, and it's very cool. The final boss is really, really good. And you get this cutscene, which looks probably better than most of the cutscenes in the game, which sounds worse than most of the game when the voice acting cut comes in, and you're just like, oh my god, why? Just no voice acting. But the ending is very good, with Rose and Zieg sacrificing themselves to save the world. Everyone else gets a happy ending, and it zooms in on these 2 kind of pulsating eggs symbolizing Rose and Zieg at the end. And it just felt like a really good ending. Okay, so with that said, we have finally made it to our final thoughts of The Legend of Dragoon. Overall, both Jane and I enjoyed this game very much. We almost always looked forward to our play sessions and getting through the game. We loved the progress we were making, And there were some days where we played like 8 hours. Like, I'm not even kidding. And that's a lot. Like, we don't normally play for 8 hours. Typically, we would do like 4 hours at most in a day. But this game had us in certain moments playing 8 hours and just making insane progress. And we really, really liked it. The day that we finished the game, it was like a 7-hour session day because we knew we were getting to the end. And it really takes a special game to make us want to play for that long. So this game, as far as old school JRPGs go, I feel like it really does stand the test of time. And if you are into JRPGs in any capacity, then I strongly recommend this game. If you have old nostalgia for the game that you remember from when you were a kid and you kind of wished you could play it, I recommend you play it. I really don't think you're going to have a bad time going back to Legend of Dragoon and playing it. The only thing you're going to have a bad time is with the inventory system. That's it. Everything else is good enough to keep you in, and I bet you can finish it and be happy with the time you spent. It took us 50 hours to beat the game. That was with following a guide and finding every single stardust in the game and then not doing anything about it. But yeah, I want to say that I am very happy that I was able to complete this game. I am super glad we chose this as one of our first games for this channel. We get to practice, making a video about it, and it was a great game to be able to do that. A nice, long, crunchy JRPG to play. We got 100% of the trophies, which was awesome. And one extra comment to make here is that most of the time when I'm showing Jane some of these old school classics, they have a hard time keeping her into them because she's into stuff like God of War, Final Fantasy 15 or 16, like these games that look a lot nicer with really good voice acting and, are easier to keep your attention. A lot of the old games kind of lost her a bit, but Legend of Dragoon kept her attention throughout the whole thing as well. So whether you are a nostalgic person going back to it or somebody who has never played it before, and are generally more into the more modern games, I think you're going to find enjoyment in this game no matter what. As I said, it took us 50 hours and about 2 months total to complete, bearing in mind that both of us work full-time jobs and, and also are making these videos. So that's about what you can expect. So if you ask me the question, does this game hold up as an older game in 2024? I say yes, and especially if you're a JRPG fan, I would recommend this to anybody who has not tried it yet or anybody who has memories of playing it when they were a kid. Strongly recommend you give this game your time and get through it, and I really don't think you're going to be unhappy. So, with that being said, this is the end of the video. I want to thank you guys so much if you've made it to this part of the video. I really appreciate it. I think it's pretty obvious that we've tried a different approach with this video. I believe that the right way to make a good YouTube video is probably to write an essay and be a little bit more professional about it. The truth is, for this particular video, if we were going to do that, it's going to take an extra couple months probably. Maybe that's longer than I meant. Maybe about 1 extra month, but we're getting to the point where it's been too long since our last video came out. We decided we would just riff on it and just get it out there so that we can move on to the next video. Likely for future videos, I will be writing essays and trying to keep it a little more less rambly. I think it's going to turn out okay. Please let me know your thoughts in the description below. And just know we're just cutting our teeth on this stuff. It's taken us a while to get into the swing of things, but we're starting to come up with a schedule where we can continuously play games and continuously work on videos. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to bring you videos at a faster rate the better we get at it. Okay, so again, thank you so much for making it to this part of the video. My name is Casey, and Jane is in the background. We are both Critics Compendium, and we are looking to build this channel and play all sorts of different games. We already have the next one lined up. We're playing it and recording footage right now. I'm not going to say what it is, and we'll see you next time.